Between monumental perfection and silent collapse lies the twilight of Egypt's greatest dream. When the pyramids ceased to rise, it wasn't sudden catastrophe, but slow erosion that ended the age of stone eternity. The Nile's rhythm faltered, royal authority diffused among priests and nomarchs, and divine kingship fractured beneath its own weight. As Pepi II's 90-year reign finally closed, an exhausted empire surrendered not to enemies, but to entropy. Faith turned inward, carved in texts instead of mountains. From this unraveling emerged not just famine and fragmentation, but wisdom, that civilization endures not through permanence, but through adaptation, that even eternity requires renewal. At the meeting of two lands, where the Nile spills its gift of silt into the delta, the world once seemed divided between chaos and order. I stand where the black earth meets the red, the fertile valley pressing against the desert's edge like life clinging to death. Here, Egypt began, not as a single kingdom, but as a rhythm of water, wind, and faith that slowly gathered into one pulse. Before kings, there were chiefs and petty lords, men who ruled stretches of riverbank under the favor of their local gods. Their banners, painted with falcons or reeds, fluttered in the dust-laden air. Each nome, each small dominion, was a world unto itself. Yet the Nile ran through all of them, indifferent to borders. It flooded and withdrew with the patience of eternity, shaping both soil and soul. In time, one leader would see in this endless cycle the promise of unity. They called him Nama, though some say Menes, the bringer of order. He was not merely a conqueror, but a weaver, binding the upper land of the white crown to the lower land of the red. On his ceremonial pallet, still preserved in stone, he smites an enemy beneath a gaze that is half human, half divine. Yet look closer and you see something else. Not triumph, but creation. This was Egypt's first act of becoming, a land stitched together by ritual violence and sacred design. When Nama's armies marched north, they carried more than spears. They bore a new idea, that the land itself could be one body, its lifeblood the Nile, its heart the king. Every future monarch would claim descent from that first union, and every rebellion against order would be cast as a return to primordial chaos. Through him, the Egyptian world learned to think in pairs. Upper and lower, desert and valley, life and death, king and people. It was not mere politics, it was theology in motion. To hold such a kingdom together required more than war. It demanded ma'at, the balance between human will and divine truth. I can almost hear the priests of that first court chanting before dawn, invoking the goddess whose feather measured the worth of souls. Ma'at was not an abstraction. She was the air they breathed, the pattern that kept the Nile steady and the stars aligned. To defy her was to invite drought or civil strife. To uphold her was to make time itself obedient. From this vision rose the age of divine kingship. The ruler was not a mere mortal who governed by right of conquest. He was the living image of Horus, the falcon whose eye never sleeps. When the king walked, the gods walked. When he ruled, the cosmos held its breath in harmony. To disobey him was not treason, but sacrilege. In this sacred arrangement, even death was not an ending, but a passage through royal order. Across the floodplain, a new capital rose where the two lands met. Memphis, a city placed between heaven and earth. Its walls of white limestone caught the sun like a mirror of eternity. From here, the pharaoh watched both Upper and Lower Egypt, neither fully belonging to one nor the other. Every sunrise that struck its temples confirmed that unity had not been a fleeting miracle, but a perpetual covenant. Memphis was more than a city. It was an instrument of control. The scribes worked there, their reed pens whispering across papyrus, recording harvests, births, and offerings. Grain was measured, taxes counted, rituals timed to the breath of the river. The king's word, carried on clay seals and wooden tablets, reached provinces hundreds of miles away. For the first time in Egypt's history, the will of one man could travel faster than his feet. As the bureaucracy grew, so too did the layers of belief. Officials were no longer servants of a human monarch, but caretakers of divine harmony. The vizier stood at the right hand of the king, the tongue of the gods, the judge of men. Below him, priests tended to the temple estates, scribes maintained order through ink, and provincial governors, the Nomarchs, ruled in the king's name. Egypt became a body of many organs, each fed by the river and commanded by the crown. Yet even divinity demanded a dwelling place. The first rulers were buried not in pyramids, but in great mastabas, low rectangular tombs built of mud brick, their walls angled like a slumbering horizon. Beneath them, corridors and chambers stretched into the earth, filled with vessels, food, and symbols of power. These were not graves in the common sense. They were extensions of the palace, eternal residences from which the pharaoh would continue to rule the afterlife. When I walk through the necropolis of early Memphis, the silence feels deliberate, as if the dead themselves enforce it. The mastabas lie in ordered rows, their entrances facing east toward the reborn sun. On their walls, servants offer bread and beer to their masters, gestures repeated every day by the living priests above. It was a dialogue between two worlds, and the king was its interpreter. The early Egyptians believed that if the ruler's spirit endured, so too would the nation. The artisans who built these tombs were the first to turn dust into destiny. They mixed mud with straw, set bricks under the glare of the desert, and carved names into polished stone. Each hammer blow was an act of faith, not just in the king, but in permanence itself. For them, architecture was theology in form. The line between sacred and practical did not yet exist. But the land was too vast, and its people too many, for even divine kingship to rule without structure. The flood of administration followed the flood of the Nile. Record keepers in each nome calculated tribute, collected surplus grain, and filled granaries that gleamed like gold in the sunlight. In the south, quarries began to yield the first limestone blocks for shrines and royal markers. In the north, ships loaded with stone and copper moved along the Nile like veins of civilization. From this collaboration between the divine and the diligent emerged the first whispers of something grander. The idea that stone could outlast flesh, that death could be answered with monument. The mastaba was no longer enough. Eternity demanded height. Soon, architects would look to the horizon and imagine stairways rising from the desert to the heavens. When I look at the plain where the first pyramids would one day rise, the landscape feels expectant. The wind shifts the sand, revealing fragments of pottery, tools, and old foundations. The fingerprints of a people learning to translate belief into geometry. Every grain of sand once passed through the hands of laborers who believed that to serve the king was to sustain the cosmos. Yet beneath this harmony, a question lingered. If a man could build eternity, what need had he of gods? The early kings did not yet ask it aloud, but the answer would shape their destiny. Divine kingship promised that order could be eternal, but order requires obedience, and obedience must be fed, with grain, with stone, with faith. The unification of Egypt brought peace, but also a burden. to prove that peace itself could last forever. The king's body would die, his memory must not. The tomb became not only a resting place, but a machine against oblivion. Each new generation of builders pushed the limits of what human hands could sanctify. Here, on the banks of the Nile, I can almost sense that ambition stirring, the conviction that through balance, labor, and devotion, even mortality could be conquered. The river flows on, patient and eternal, as if mocking the fragile grandeur of men. But for a moment in history, Egypt believed it could match the Nile in endurance. And that belief, born of mud brick and faith, of pen and prayer, would soon find its first true monument. A man named Djoser would dream of building a staircase not of reeds or sunbeams, but of stone itself. And through his vision, Egypt would enter the age of pyramids. At Saqqara, the desert rises in long ochre waves above the green edge of the Nile. The wind carries the scent of dust and sun-baked limestone, and in that silence broken only by distant hammers, Egypt found its voice in stone. Here, a man named Djoser, second king of the third dynasty, looked upon the sands and imagined a monument that would defy decay itself. I walk now along the ancient causeway toward what remains of his vision, the step pyramid, its weathered tiers lifting heavenward like a frozen hymn. It stands not as a ruin, but as the first successful argument against mortality. Before Djoser, kings had been buried in mastabas, flat, solid, and humble. But the new age demanded more than continuity. It demanded immortality you could see from miles away. Djoser's Egypt had grown confident. Its scribes could account for every sack of grain. Its priests could chart the stars. Its officials could manage hundreds of thousands of laborers. The kingdom was efficient, stable, and devout. Yet stability bred ambition, and ambition sought form. Somewhere in the mind of the king, the notion stirred that if the pharaoh embodied divine order on earth, then his tomb must embody eternity itself. To translate that desire into reality, Djoser turned to a man of remarkable intellect. His vizier, Imhotep, part priest, part engineer, part philosopher. Imhotep was said to speak both the language of men and of gods. His name would echo for millennia, worshipped in later ages as a deity of wisdom and healing. But in this time, he was simply the king's instrument, the mind behind the miracle. Imhotep began where tradition ended. He took the simple mastaba and conceived of stacking it, one layer upon another, forming a staircase to the divine. What emerged from that experiment was a 6-stepped mountain of limestone, towering nearly 200 feet above the desert. Nothing of its kind had ever been attempted. Each tier symbolized the pharaoh's ascent through the heavens, from earth to the imperishable stars. Standing before it now, I try to imagine the first moment it pierced the horizon. For the workers hauling stone under the blaze of Ra's eye, it must have seemed like the earth itself was learning to rise. The quarries at Tura rang with hammer and chisel. Boats creaked under the weight of limestone blocks. Overseers shouted orders drowned by wind and labor. Yet this was no tyranny of whips and chains. This was the choreography of faith. Every man who lifted a block believed he was contributing to the body of a god. Egypt's early engineers did not merely build, they orchestrated the cosmos. Ramps rose like arteries around the pyramid's growing frame. Scaffolds climbed skyward, and each layer was precisely aligned with the cardinal points. The work demanded mathematics, astronomy, and logistics on a scale the world had never seen. Imhotep's blueprints were drawn not on papyrus, but in the geometry of faith. Yet Djoser's complex was not limited to the pyramid itself. Spread across 37 acres, it was an entire city of eternity. temples, courtyards, shrines, and the great enclosure wall, whose white limestone glistened like frozen sunlight. Reliefs along the walls show Djoser performing the ancient Hebsed festival, running between two markers to prove his vitality before the gods. The irony was deliberate. In death, he would perform the ritual forever, preserved in stone as an image of eternal kingship. As I trace the outlines of those carvings, I can still sense the faith they once inspired. The step pyramid did not only elevate the king, it redefined Egypt's relationship with the divine. The pharaoh's body might die, but his essence, his ka, would climb this stairway toward the gods, and through him, Egypt itself would endure. The innovation of stone changed everything. Mud brick decayed, but limestone endured like a frozen prayer. In transforming perishable material into permanence, Djoser and Imhotep declared that time could be mastered. Every block bore that declaration. The pyramid's very surface caught the light of Ra each morning, a reflection of cosmic order, a reassurance that the king's reign extended beyond the grave. But this was more than a monument to death. It was propaganda in purest form. The step pyramid was visible for miles across the floodplain, a constant reminder that the divine order resided in one man. Farmers ploughing their fields looked up and saw proof that the world still functioned as it should. The sun rose, the river swelled, and the king endured. Faith and authority became indistinguishable. Yet for all its majesty, the step pyramid was also a laboratory. Inside, beneath its monumental calm, lay confusion and experiment. Corridors wound through the bedrock like veins of an ancient creature, sealed passageways, dummy chambers, decoy tombs. It was both fortress and mystery. The architects were learning as they built, solving problems of weight, angle, and pressure never faced before. Every miscalculation carried the risk of collapse, yet the result was triumph. Egypt had discovered the grammar of eternity. Even in fragments, the artistry of the complex astonishes. Along the northern temple, where rituals of rebirth were once performed, fragments of blue faience tiles glimmer faintly in the dust. They were meant to mimic the reeds of a celestial marsh, the paradise where kings were reborn. Here, in this simulated eternity, Djoser would rule forever among the gods. But while the pyramid was meant to last forever, it required the endless labor of the living. The administration at Memphis expanded to meet the demands of the project. Stoneworkers, scribes, haulers, bakers, and priests, all were woven into a single machine of devotion. Their sustenance came from vast royal estates. Their work was measured in generations. Egypt's first monumental economy was born not from conquest, but from belief. And belief is costly. For every monument raised to heaven, there are unseen burdens below. The royal cults required constant offerings, the temple's endless maintenance, the bureaucracy continuous tribute. For now, abundance hid the strain, but one can already glimpse the equation that would one day break the kingdom. Divine permanence paid for by human toil. Still, in Djoser's lifetime, the balance held. The Nile flooded predictably, the granaries overflowed, and the temples sang with incense and hymns. Egypt stood at the dawn of what the world would later call the Pyramid Age, an era when architecture became theology and stone became scripture. To walk through Saqqara at dusk is to feel that dawn preserved in silence. The sun bleeds into the desert, and the pyramid's long shadow reaches across the sand like the arm of a god. For Djoser, this was not a monument, but a ladder between worlds, a promise carved in limestone that the pharaoh's soul would never die. And yet, even perfection invites imitation. After Djoser's death, kings who followed would seek to surpass him, each reaching higher, each testing the limits of stone and of faith. The dream of eternity had begun, and with it, the rivalry to outlast time itself. Soon, a new ruler named Sneferu would inherit this dream and turn ambition into obsession. He would build not one, but 3 pyramids, each an experiment in geometry and endurance. And through his restless pursuit of perfection, Egypt would reach both its greatest height and the first tremor of its fall. There is a stillness in the desert at Djoser, where 2 pyramids stand like twin hearts half buried in time. Their slopes catch the sun at strange angles, one bent, one perfect. And between them lies the story of a king's pursuit of immortality. His name was Sneferu, the first great builder of Egypt's golden age, and the man who turned Djoser's experiment into a national faith. By the time Sneferu ascended the throne, the kingdom had grown both wealthy and disciplined. Memphis hummed with the music of scribes' pens and the clatter of copper tools. The royal storehouses bulged with grain and gold. The people believed their ruler was the living embodiment of Ra, the sun god whose daily rebirth mirrored the promise of the king's eternity. And yet, Sneferu was not content to inherit faith. He sought to make it tangible, to sculpt divine perfection out of the impermanence of stone. I picture him standing on the edge of the plateau at Maidum, the wind whipping at his linen cloak, the half-finished pyramid rising behind him. It began as another step structure, following Djoser's model, but ambition demanded smoother lines, a shape closer to heaven's curve. The builders encased the old core in fine limestone, filling its terraces to create the first true pyramid, smooth, seamless, eternal. But the stones shifted under their own weight, and the structure cracked like a body under strain. What remains at Maidum today is both monument and ruin, the broken dream of a man unwilling to accept limits. The outer casing slid away long ago, collapsing into a mound of rubble that hides the steps beneath. And yet, even in failure, the site has a terrible beauty. The fallen stones gleam in the sun like the scales of a sleeping god. Sneferu did not mourn long. A pharaoh could not admit defeat, not to his people, and certainly not to the gods. He gathered his architects and ordered a new attempt farther south, at Djoser. Here, the bent pyramid rose from the desert, like a monument caught between 2 decisions. Its lower slope ascends steeply, then suddenly angles inward, as though the builders lost their nerve halfway to heaven. Scholars argue over why: structural weakness, a change of plan, or the fear of another collapse. But perhaps it was something simpler, the visible hesitation of human hands reaching too high. The bent pyramid remains one of Egypt's strangest creations. Its casing stones, still intact in places, shimmer with the pale light of early morning. Within, its corridors rise at impossible angles, walls pressed so close that the air seems to hold its breath. To step inside is to feel the architect's anxiety preserved in stone. And yet, even here, Sneferu saw revelation rather than failure. The structure did not fall. It stood, awkward but enduring, a lesson written in geometry. From that lesson came perfection. At last, farther north, Sneferu built his masterpiece, the Red Pyramid, so named for the copper hue its stones take under the setting sun. It rises from the desert floor with serene certainty, its lines unbroken, its summit precise as thought itself. This was the culmination of a decade of trial and vision, the world's first successful smooth-sided pyramid. To imagine its construction is to glimpse Egypt at full command of its powers. Thousands of workers labored in teams, hauling massive limestone blocks along earthen ramps, their chants echoing across the plain. Foremen measured angles with cords of knotted flax. Priests consecrated each foundation with ritual offerings of beer and blood. Scribes tracked deliveries from quarries, bakeries, and breweries, turning labor into mathematics. It was faith transformed into industry, a divine economy powered by order and precision. Sneferu's building campaigns consumed vast resources. Timber for sledges came from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, stone from Tura and Aswan. The Nile became a highway of devotion, filled with barges carrying not only materials but ideology. The logistics alone required an administrative genius, Egypt's first true national mobilization. And through it all, the pharaoh's image gleamed from stele and temple walls, radiant, unaging, the earthly mirror of the sun. The effect on Egypt was transformative. Villages near the quarries became towns. Artisans trained their sons to carve hieroglyphs and lay polished stone. Overseers and scribes rose to positions of wealth and prestige. For the first time, an entire generation could say they had built something eternal and been paid in both bread and glory. The pyramid was no longer just a tomb. It was the beating heart of the kingdom, the reason its people rose each day to work, to worship, to exist. But there was more than devotion driving Sneferu's vision. The old faith in Ma'at, the harmony between heaven and earth, demanded constant proof. Each perfect line of the pyramid was a declaration that order still reigned, that the gods favored Egypt, that the king's hand steadied the world. The red pyramid's symmetry was theology rendered in stone. At its completion, Sneferu's subjects celebrated for days. Offerings filled the temple courtyards, and processions of priests carried banners embroidered with solar discs and falcons. The pharaoh himself appeared before them in shining regalia, the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt gleaming with electrum. He was no longer merely ruler of the two lands. He was the axis of creation, the mortal who bridged the divine and the human. Yet even triumph casts a shadow. The perfection of the Red Pyramid came at a cost that would echo through generations. The scale of Egypt's mobilization meant that vast portions of the population and economy now revolved around royal projects. Whole towns lived and died by the needs of construction. The system worked while prosperity endured, while the Nile flooded generously, while harvests remained steady. But one poor season, one weak successor, could turn grandeur into burden. In Sneferu's lifetime, such dangers seemed distant. The land prospered, the temples flourished, and Egypt's identity crystallized around the sun cult that would dominate its theology. The king was the child of Ra, the horizon his throne, eternity his domain. It was an age intoxicated with certainty, the belief that through symmetry, order, and divine will, humanity could master death itself. Today, when the sun sets behind the Red Pyramid, the light spills down its face in a perfect gradient, bathing the desert in crimson. It feels less like the end of day than the pulse of an immense heart still beating beneath the sand. Sneferu's dream endures not because he built perfectly, but because he dared to fail magnificently. His experiments would inspire his son, Khufu, to pursue perfection beyond measure, to build a monument so vast it would define not only a kingdom, but an idea of eternity itself. Yet even as Egypt reached for the heavens, the seeds of its fragility were already sown. For nothing built by human hands, however divine its intent, is without weight. The next generation would learn that truth amid the glare of the Giza plateau, where ambition would reach its zenith and begin, imperceptibly, to bend toward decline. Over the plateau at Giza, The air ripples with heat. The desert glows like a kiln, and out of that furnace rises the most audacious dream of all, a mountain of stone built by human hands. From the fertile fields below, its gleaming sides seem to scrape the sun itself. The people call it Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, and for 1,000 generations, it will remain Egypt's most enduring gesture toward the divine. From the city that sprawls at its base, the sounds of work never fade. Hammers strike copper against limestone. Sledges groan across packed ramps. Overseers shout orders above the chorus of men. Every day begins before dawn, when the light of Ra turns the sands to gold. Smoke from bakeries and breweries mingles with incense from the temples, feeding both laborers and gods. Here, on this plateau of light and dust, the king's will becomes visible. Across the two lands, Khufu's command resounds. Quarrymen in the eastern cliffs of Tura cut blocks so smooth they gleam like frozen moonlight. Along the Nile, flotillas of barges drift northward, their decks loaded with stone. In the marshes of the delta, carpenters craft sledges from imported cedar. Far south, in Nubia, miners chip copper and gold from the bedrock, metals that will adorn the tomb's sacred chambers. Egypt moves as one body, every artery feeding this colossal heart at Giza. Within Memphis, the scribes track each detail. Their reed pens scratch across papyrus, noting rations, deliveries, and days worked. The administration has become a living organism, its pulse measured in ink. Each worker receives bread, onions, and beer in precise amounts. Each overseer answers to another above him. A hierarchy mirrors the structure they build, thousands of small lives stacked beneath a single, unshakable peak. The pharaoh's bureaucracy is now as enduring as his stone. Teams of builders move like rivers of flesh against the rock. Men sing rhythmic chants as they haul the sledges, their feet sinking into the sand. Cattle drag the heavier loads, while gangs of masons shape the stones with polished dolerite. Dust hangs in the air like incense, glowing in the noon light. To them, this is no ordinary labor. It is devotion. Every strike of the hammer echoes the heartbeat of Egypt itself. In the camps nearby, life has its own order. The workers' village, laid out in straight streets with communal bakeries and sleeping houses, is a city in miniature, reflecting the precision of the pyramid above. Walls are painted with scenes of harvests and feasts. Even in hardship, they preserve the image of abundance. Archaeologists who one day uncover this place will find evidence of bread ovens, fish bones, and pottery marked with royal seals, the trace of a state that fed its faith through flesh and grain. But beyond its mechanics, the pyramid is philosophy incarnate. To the priests who oversee the rituals, every measurement carries cosmic weight. The base is aligned perfectly to the 4 cardinal points. Its height forms a sacred ratio, mirroring the proportions of the earth itself. The king's chamber, buried deep within, is the axis of creation, the place where the divine breath meets the mortal body. Each polished face reflects the journey of the sun, affirming the king's identity as the child of Ra. From afar, the Great Pyramid appears serene. Up close, its precision is overwhelming. The casing stones fit so tightly that a knife cannot slide between them. Inside, narrow corridors wind upward into chambers that smell of cool dust and stillness. Here, the air itself feels ceremonial. When torches flicker against the granite walls, the stone seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, as though guarding its own silence. In this darkness, the king will sleep, not as corpse, but as god. Yet perfection bears a cost. The pyramid consumes more than stone. It devours labor, copper, and time itself. To sustain this colossal enterprise, taxes flow from every province. Grain pours from distant granaries into Memphis. The priests bless the work as holy, but the farmers who surrender their harvests begin to see holiness measured in burdens. For now, they obey willingly. Faith outweighs fatigue. But each offering added to the temple's scales tips Egypt closer toward imbalance. As years pass, the monument grows, and with it, the aura of the king. Khufu becomes less a man than a principle, the embodiment of order, distant and absolute. In the temples, his name is intoned with that of the gods. His likeness is carved in hard diorite, his eyes unblinking. No one speaks of his temper, his decrees, or the lives consumed in his service. History will remember only the light on stone, not the sweat beneath it. When the final casing is set, the summit capped with electrum that flashes like the morning star, Egypt rejoices. Priests march in procession, their chants rising like a tide of sound. Offerings fill the courtyards of Memphis. Cattle are sacrificed, and incense clouds the sky. The Great Pyramid is declared complete. The House of Eternity finished, the Pharaoh's divinity proven. For a moment, the kingdom stands at its zenith. Standing at the pyramid's base, I imagine the day of dedication. The desert would have gleamed white and blinding, the people craning their necks to see the gleam of gold atop the stone mountain. For them, this was not architecture, it was revelation. The world had found its center, and it was here. In Khufu's reign, Egypt ceased to be a land of scattered villages and became a single machine of belief, unified under the shadow of perfection. But beneath that shadow, cracks already form. The priesthoods of Ra and Osiris compete for influence. Estates granted to maintain the royal cult swell with untaxed wealth. The same bureaucracy that once served the king now begins to serve itself. The pyramid, for all its purity of line, conceals a paradox. To preserve order eternally, the crown must exhaust the living. When night falls over Giza, the monument darkens, its edges dissolving into the sky. The stars gather above it, the same stars the Egyptians called the imperishables, the eternal companions of the king's soul. It is said that Khufu's spirit ascended to join them, crossing the narrow stairway of the northern shaft to dwell among the lights forever. And yet his people remained below. In the sand and toil, their faith turned to stone along with his dream. From this height, Egypt would never rise higher. The Great Pyramid stands as the summit of divine kingship, flawless, immovable, complete. But perfection is a dangerous balance. In the generations that follow, the same brilliance that created it will begin to consume itself. The sons of Khufu will build smaller monuments, as if already aware that the gods grow weary of such grandeur. Beneath the calm geometry of the Great Pyramid lies the first whisper of decline, the faint reminder that even eternity has a cost. Morning returns to the plateau, and the Great Pyramid throws its immense shadow across the sand. In that shadow rises another monument, smaller but no less commanding. The Pyramid of Khafre, son of Khufu, heir to the radiance of the sun. To the people of Egypt, he is the continuation of his father's light, the next link in the chain of divine order. Yet to build after perfection is a perilous task. What remains for a son when his father has reached the summit of eternity? From the first days of his reign, Khafre sought not to rival, but to preserve. His pyramid, poised on higher ground, appears almost equal to his father's when seen from the valley below, a clever illusion, born of engineering and ambition. At its foot, he placed something the world had never seen before, the Great Sphinx, its lion's body crouched before the desert, its human face bearing the calm of immortal kingship. Carved directly from the bedrock, it watched the rising sun with the stillness of prophecy. To stand before it, even now, is to feel its gaze cross centuries. The Sphinx is not merely sculpture, but revelation, a fusion of earth and divinity. The lion's strength, the pharaoh's wisdom, the god's eternity, all three meet in one colossal form. For Khafre, it was both guardian and mirror, a reminder that his power must remain unblinking, even as the sands shifted around him. In the valleys and causeways surrounding Giza, the machinery of faith continued to hum. Processional roads lined with polished stone connected the river to the tombs, carrying priests, offerings, and the echoes of ceremony. Temples bloomed at each pyramid's base, courts filled with incense and chant, sanctuaries where statues of the pharaoh received daily offerings. The king was not only remembered in death, he was fed, dressed, and worshipped as if alive. These temples, more than the pyramids themselves, revealed the hidden transformation taking root in Egypt's soul. Across the floodplain, the priesthood of Ra grew in strength. The king's divinity, once absolute, now required intermediaries. Priests conducted rituals that only they could interpret, managing the flow of wealth and sacrifice. Their estates grew rich from endowments meant to sustain the royal cults, and their influence reached deep into the countryside. The pharaoh still ruled by divine right, but that divinity increasingly passed through the hands of others. In the bright light of Giza's perfection, new powers were quietly taking shape. Meanwhile, in the workshops of Memphis and Heliopolis, sculptors and scribes found new ways to glorify their kings. The statues of Khafre, carved from dark diorite, gleamed like polished night. Upon his shoulders perched the falcon of Horus, its wings drawn protectively around the royal head. It is a vision of harmony, man and God, flesh and eternity, fused in stillness. Yet beneath that serenity lies a hint of distance. The pharaoh's gaze turned upward, away from his people, toward the heaven he claimed as his domain. When Khafre died, his pyramid and sphinx already commanded the desert, like twin symbols of vigilance and faith. His successor, Menkaure, inherited a kingdom that glittered on the surface yet trembled beneath. Determined to honor the past without repeating its weight, he chose a smaller pyramid, graceful, proportioned, wrapped in a casing of red granite at its base. To later generations, it would appear modest. To his own, it was a gesture of mercy. Menkaure's reign marked a shift in Egypt's spirit. The grand projects of his forebears had proven that eternity could be built, but also that eternity demanded a price. The new king turned his attention to justice and prosperity. Reliefs from his mortuary temple show him walking hand in hand with the goddess Hathor, a symbol of tenderness rare in royal art. She offers him the emblem of life, not as ruler of gods, but as protector of his people. At Giza, his artisans achieved perfection in miniature. The famous triads, statues depicting Menkaure with Hathor and the deities of various provinces, reveal a softer, more intimate divinity. The sculptor's hands captured not grandeur, but grace. In their balanced forms lies the suggestion that power need not tower to endure, that harmony could be carved as finely as stone. Even so, the administrative machine continued to expand. Temples multiplied, scribes copied hymns and tax rolls, and the estates of priests flourished. The more wealth poured into the cults, the less returned to the crown. Egypt's unity depended on abundance, and abundance depended on control. Yet control, once absolute, was now divided among many hands. During Menkaure's later years, whispers spread of shortened rations, of harvests stretched thin to meet temple demands. The king ordered reliefs of offerings, cattle, bread, fruits of every kind, to adorn his walls, as if image alone could summon plenty. Faith remained strong, but the balance of Ma'at, once held so firmly, began to quiver. The same rituals that had secured Egypt's eternity now burdened its living. Still, the people looked to Giza and saw proof of divine order. Each dawn, the sun rose between the pyramids like a god reborn, its rays striking the faces of the monuments in sequence, Khufu first, then Khafre, then Menkaure. It was a celestial choreography, the very image of dynastic continuity. The priests proclaimed that as long as this cycle endured, Egypt would never fall. But dynasties, like rivers, change course. Beneath the hymns and incense, quiet rivalries brewed. Priestly families accumulated power. Provincial nobles strengthened their ties to local temples, and the court at Memphis grew heavy with ceremony. The pyramid fields stood perfect, but the society that had built them was becoming brittle. Standing atop the plateau, I watched the desert glow with evening light. The pyramids throw their shadows far across the plain, their edges blurring with the coming dusk. Once, these monuments had promised unbroken harmony between man and God. Now they seem like colossal anchors, holding Egypt to a past it could no longer afford to repeat. As the sun dips behind Khafre's sphinx, the face of the lion fades into silhouette, its gaze fixed eternally eastward, toward the dawn that once crowned kings. Tomorrow, that dawn will return, as always, but it will fall on smaller pyramids and upon a kingdom beginning, quietly, to change. Across the horizon of Giza, the air once trembled with the rhythm of hammers and chants. Now, only the wind moves. The pyramids still catch the sun, perfect as the day they were sealed, but the song of the builders has faded into silence. Egypt, exhausted by its own greatness, begins to draw breath again. A long exhale after centuries of striving toward the heavens. Farther south, at Saqqara and Abu Sir, new kings rise from the line of Khufu, and with them, new intentions. The monuments they command are smaller, their angles gentler, their ambitions less absolute. These are not failures of will, but concessions to reality. For the first time in living memory, Egypt's rulers turn their gaze away from the stone mountains of their ancestors and toward the radiant sun that governs all life. The reign of Shepseskaf, Khufu's grandson, marks the first turning of the age. He rejects the pyramid form altogether, choosing instead a long, low tomb called the Mastabat el Pharaoun, the pharaoh's bench. Carved of massive limestone, it lies flat against the desert like a monument in repose. To the priests of Ra, it is heresy. To Shepseskaf, perhaps humility. His choice speaks softly but clearly. Eternity may not always require assent. In the generations that follow, the royal builders return to smaller designs, each a step further from Giza's perfection. The fifth dynasty inherits a kingdom still wealthy, but no longer inexhaustible. Quarries grow quiet, work crews disperse, and temples multiply like vines across the floodplain. The energy that once converged on a single point, the pharaoh's tomb, now spreads outward, feeding 1,000 altars. The age of pure stone gives way to the age of sunlight. At Abu Ghurab, the kings of this new dynasty build not pyramids, but solar temples, open sanctuaries dedicated to the sun god Ra. Their courts blaze with polished quartz and golden obelisks that catch and scatter the morning light. These are not tombs, but living altars, places where priests greet the dawn with hymns and offerings. The emphasis shifts from death to renewal, from the stone permanence of the king to the eternal rebirth of the sun. This transformation is both spiritual and political. As the cult of Ra ascends, so too does the power of those who serve him. The high priests of Heliopolis become the new arbiters of divine will, their rituals sanctified by light itself. Royal authority, once absolute, begins to diffuse through the hierarchy of temples. The pharaoh still rules as the son of Ra, but now he must share the radiance. Within the palace walls, scribes record the changing rhythms of the kingdom. In the days of Khufu, the ledgers spoke of stone and labor. Now they speak of grain and offerings, festivals and feasts. Administration replaces inspiration. Egypt's bureaucracy reaches heights of sophistication unknown before. Tax registers, labor quotas, and temple inventories written in careful hands. The government has learned how to perpetuate itself even when vision wanes. Meanwhile, in the provinces, governors, the Nomarchs, rise in stature. Once appointed at the king's pleasure, their offices now pass from father to son. They oversee irrigation, local harvests, and temple estates, commanding loyalty that once flowed only toward Memphis. In distant nomes, statues of regional lords appear beside images of the pharaoh. Power, like the Nile in flood, begins to branch and wander. In the workshops, artisans continue their craft, but their subjects change. Where once they carved the serene faces of kings, now they shape scenes of daily life. Boatmen rowing on the river, scribes bending over papyrus, farmers guiding plows through the flooded soil. Art becomes intimate, human. The divine ideal remains, but it no longer towers. It resides in gesture and detail. Egypt, weary of eternity, turns its gaze toward the present. Yet even modest monuments require resources, and the royal treasury grows thin. Expeditions to Sinai for copper and turquoise continue, but they yield less than before. Trade caravans return from Nubia with gold and incense, yet the cost of maintaining temples and priestly estates consumes much of it. The balance between crown and cult, once harmonious, tilts uneasily. At Abu Ghurab, the priests celebrate the feast of Ra, pouring libations as the sun reaches its zenith. Their hymns proclaim the gods' eternal victory over darkness, but their wealth, measured in land and laborers, now rivals that of the pharaoh they serve. Every field endowed to a temple is a field no longer taxed by the crown. The light that once sanctified kingship now illuminates a widening divide. In the midst of this transformation, the tone of Egypt's inscriptions begins to shift. Where once texts proclaimed the unbroken might of the pharaoh, they now emphasize devotion, service, and gratitude. Officials carve prayers into their tombs, thanking the king not as God, but as benefactor. The divine aura that surrounded the throne remains brilliant, but thinner, as if seen through a veil of incense and time. The change is not collapse, but transition. The fifth dynasty kings, Djoser, Sahura, Neferikara, Djoser, still rule capably, their reigns marked by prosperity and careful order. But their pyramids, though neatly built, are shadows of Giza's grandeur. The stone is lighter, the casing incomplete, the walls lined with delicate reliefs rather than vast geometry. Art replaces awe. To walk among these monuments is to feel the difference between power and memory. The air no longer hums with labor, it whispers with prayer. The walls of the solar temples glow faintly with scenes of offerings and celebration. But beyond their boundaries, the villages grow restless. The grandeur of kingship endures only in ritual. As twilight falls over Abu Ghurab, the golden altar catches the last light of the sun. The priests chant that Ra has descended into the underworld to be reborn at dawn. The faith remains unbroken, yet its focus has shifted irreversibly from the pharaoh's eternity to the gods. The divine king, who once embodied the universe, now serves as its caretaker. Egypt still appears serene, the Nile still floods, the temples still ring with hymns. But beneath the calm, the first tremors of imbalance begin. The royal will that once raised mountains now maintains ceremonies. The Pyramid Age, radiant in memory, has entered its afternoon. At first glance, the reigns that followed seemed blessed. The pyramids of Userkaf, Sahur, and Djoser gleam pale in the desert light, smaller but precise, their walls alive with scenes of harvest and tribute. Egypt appears tranquil again, a kingdom of harmony, its people prosperous, its gods well-fed. Yet this calm hides a transformation deeper than any chisel could carve. The power that once radiated from the throne has begun to spread like sunlight across too wide a sky. From the royal court at Memphis, orders still flow north and south with regular rhythm. Caravans depart for Nubia and Punt. Ships carry cedar from Byblos, copper from Sinai, gold dust from the desert's edge. The bureaucracy hums with quiet competence. Scribes at their desks tally rations, estates, and temple offerings, their pens tracing Egypt's heartbeat in ink. Every measure of grain, every jar of beer, every loaf baked for the gods is accounted for. It is a golden age of order, but an order so finely balanced it can only last while every part obeys. Within the temples, devotion becomes industry. The priests of Ra at Heliopolis proclaim the sun as the source of all creation, and the king his earthly reflection. Yet the rituals that once exalted the pharaoh now also exalt the priests who perform them. They preside over processions, festivals, and daily offerings with growing authority, controlling the wealth that sustains each rite. Temples acquire new lands, workshops, and laborers, their revenues recorded separately from those of the crown. Egypt's faith has become a web of estates, its piety indistinguishable from its economy. In provincial towns, the change is just as profound. The Nomarchs, local governors once dependent on royal favor, now inherit their offices from father to son. Their tombs, carved into cliffs and hillsides, rival those of the capital in size and splendor. On their walls, they speak in the language once reserved for kings. I fed the hungry, I judged the poor, I made offerings to the gods. Their inscriptions proclaim loyalty to the crown, but their actions speak of autonomy. Egypt remains one kingdom, yet its pulse is becoming regional, its loyalty divided by distance. Despite these quiet shifts, prosperity continues. The Nile floods steadily. Its waters fill the irrigation channels and soak the fields with black silt. Harvests are plentiful, supporting festivals that stretch across the calendar. Music and laughter echo through the courts of Memphis. Artists refine their craft, producing reliefs of such precision they seem to breathe. In the tombs of Sahura and Neferikare, the carved figures of courtiers and merchants move in endless procession, not toward war or conquest, but towards celebration. It is as if Egypt, tired of eternity's weight, has turned to the pleasures of life itself. At sea, Egyptian ships sail farther than ever before. Reliefs from Sahur's pyramid complex show galleys heavy with foreign goods, incense from Punt, lapis from Afghanistan, cedar logs from Lebanon. The pharaohs of this age are traders as much as conquerors. Their fleets bring home not only wealth, but wonder, exotic animals, perfumes, and stories of distant lands. For a moment, the two lands seem infinite, their reach bounded only by the horizon. Yet success breeds its own complexity. The more the state expands, the more it must feed itself with records, audits, and decrees. Scribes multiply like bees in the royal hives of Memphis. Each new document requires another to confirm it, another to interpret, another to store. The simplicity of divine command has become a labyrinth of paperwork. The system functions beautifully, but it is a beauty that depends on constant motion, on every gear turning without pause. Among the elite, art reaches new refinement. Reliefs grow delicate, their lines subtle, their subjects domestic. We see nobles inspecting vineyards, fowlers catching birds in nets, women grinding grain beneath the open sky. The world of the commoner enters the tomb, stylized, idealized, but present at last. The afterlife is no longer the exclusive province of kings. It is imagined for anyone who can afford its depiction. Eternity has become a commodity, purchased with craftsmanship and inscription. In the royal necropolis, the pyramids themselves change character. Their cores are rougher, their casings thinner. What they lose in scale, they gain in complexity of design. Temples adjoining them bloom with detail, reliefs of offerings, hymns to Ra, celestial charts. The architecture grows intricate, ceremonial, rather than monumental. The pyramid is no longer a ladder to heaven, but a shrine to administration, a machine of ritual precision. When I walk among these sites, I feel the difference in the air. The silence is gentle, not oppressive. The grandeur, human, not cosmic. Egypt seems content, self-assured, almost complacent. But prosperity is a fragile grace. Each temple feast draws grain from the royal stores. Each priestly estate removes land from the king's taxation. The bureaucracy, so perfect in design, now begins to weigh upon itself. Its very efficiency breeds inertia. And yet, there is still beauty. The reliefs at Djoser's solar temple depict the king before the rising sun, his arms lifted in praise. The gods' rays fall upon him like blessings, and around him workers bring offerings of every kind. The scene glows with harmony. Man, God, and earth aligned. But behind the art lies a different truth. The resources of Egypt are now divided among too many altars. The sun's light touches all, but its warmth is thinner. In the countryside, farmers murmur that the priests of Heliopolis grow rich while the granaries of their gnomes run low. Nomarchs hold banquets to prove their generosity. Their wealth, inherited and untaxed, breeds small courts of loyalty. The pharaoh's envoys travel farther to collect tribute and return with smaller offerings. The kingdom still calls itself eternal, but eternity now requires negotiation. Still, to most, Egypt appears unshaken. The Nile flows, temples ring with music, and the pharaoh's image gleams on every wall. The gods remain faithful, or so it seems. Only in hindsight can one see that stability itself had become Egypt's illusion. Beneath the surface of harmony, small fractures widen like cracks in a sun-baked wall. By the end of this dynasty, the pharaohs still rule, but their reach has shortened. Their pyramids stand completed yet modest, their names carved not in thunder but in whisper. The empire of stone has given way to an empire of ink. Egypt remains luminous, but the brilliance now hides fatigue. The next age will inherit this refinement, its wealth and its contradictions. The bureaucracy that sustained eternity will soon sustain itself, and in the quiet provinces along the river, new powers begin to dream. Men who owe their fortunes not to kings, but to time. Far from Memphis, the river winds through fields of wheat and barley, past villages where the scent of mud and grain hangs heavy in the air. The people still honor the king. His name is carved on shrines, sung in hymns, whispered in prayers at dawn. Yet it has been years since they have seen his emissaries. The Nile's rhythm continues. the fields yield their harvests, and life flows on, not because of royal command, but because the river itself endures. Across these fertile provinces, a new kind of lord has risen, the Nomarch, ruler of a nome, guardian of its temples, keeper of its granaries. Once, these men were servants of the throne, appointed to govern in the king's name. Now, their titles pass from father to son, their seals carved with hereditary pride. They rule not as deputies, but as princes in miniature, loyal in word, independent in deed. Egypt remains one land, yet the threads that bind it have begun to fray. In the cliff tombs of Beni Hassan and Abydos, inscriptions tell their stories. I was a true servant of the king, one governor proclaims, but none commanded my nome but I. The walls show long processions of offerings, not to Pharaoh, but to the local gods. Hathor, Khnum, Osiris. Reliefs depict the nomarch seated upon his chair, receiving tribute from his people, judging disputes, rewarding loyalty. These scenes, carved with delicate pride, reveal a world turning inward. Within the great temples, the priesthood continues its ceremonies, but their allegiance grows regional. At Heliopolis, the priests of Ra maintain their solar rituals, declaring the sun supreme over all Egypt. At Abydos, followers of Osiris exalt the god of the dead, whose resurrection promises life beyond the grave. The unity of belief that once centered on the divine king now splinters into local cults, each glowing with its own fervor. The sacred has become provincial, the eternal divided. The royal court in Memphis still issues decrees, but they travel slowly along the Nile, obeyed more from custom than conviction. Messengers bearing royal seals must negotiate with each governor, who guards his nome like a small kingdom. Taxes sent northward arrive diminished. Grain meant for Memphis fills local granaries first. The bureaucracy, once Egypt's spine, now bends under the weight of distance and privilege. In the south, the nomarchs of Thebes and Coptos grow ambitious. Their nomes are rich in stone, gold, and grain, their armies loyal. They build temples rivaling those of the crown and record their achievements with royal grandeur. I built for the gods, I made my people prosper. Their scribes write in the polished hieroglyphs once reserved for the pharaoh's decrees. In every stroke of ink lies quiet defiance. And yet, this decentralization does not feel like rebellion. Not yet. The nomarchs maintain the illusion of unity. They send offerings to Memphis. They praise the pharaoh in formal inscriptions. They swear by his name at feasts. But it is a politeness masking autonomy. Egypt has become a mosaic. Brilliant pieces still joined by habit, not by force. For the common people, life changes little. They sow and reap. They celebrate the festivals of the gods. They pay their dues to whichever lord stands nearest. To them, the king is distant as the sun itself, a light seen but not felt. In their prayers, the word pharaoh becomes less a man and more an idea, the name of order itself, invoked out of tradition rather than trust. Art too begins to shift. In the tombs of the provinces, new styles flourish. Local gods, regional costumes, scenes of daily work and pleasure. The rigid hierarchies of earlier art soften. Nobles pose beside their wives and children. Servants are shown laughing or arguing, their gestures lively and unrestrained. These walls capture not the perfection of divine order, but the texture of life as it was lived. The human replaces the cosmic. Even in Memphis, whispers reach the court. Governors who act without permission, priests who keep a portion of the offerings for their own estates, officials who ignore royal summons. The treasury yields less silver, fewer jars of oil, fewer shipments of grain. The scribes continue to record numbers, but the columns no longer balance. Order remains as an image, not as a fact. The pharaohs of this era, Djedkare, Izesi, Unas, still claim divine titles, still build pyramids, but smaller, narrower, more intricate. The walls of Unas's tomb gleam with hieroglyphs, the first pyramid texts, hymns and spells carved deep into the stone. They promise the king's soul eternal ascent to the stars, not through monuments, but through words. It is as if Egypt, sensing the limits of stone, has begun to seek immortality in language. These sacred writings mark both innovation and confession. The words themselves are exquisite. O king, you are this great star, the companion of Orion who traverses the sky with the gods. Yet behind their poetry lies anxiety. For the first time, the afterlife requires reassurance. The pyramid is no longer enough. Faith must be written, not built. Meanwhile, the Nile grows uncertain. Some years it floods too high, drowning crops, others too low, leaving fields parched. The bureaucracy struggles to adjust, its ledgers filled with prayers disguised as figures. The people mutter that the gods have turned their faces away, or that the king, grown distant, no longer upholds Ma'at. Faith frays as hunger returns to memory. By the end of the 5th dynasty, Egypt's unity has become a ritual more than a reality. The pharaoh's name is still spoken in every temple, but it is an echo, not a command. The Nomarchs rule their nomes with efficiency and pride, raising their own cults, building their own tombs, and recording their own legends. The king, divine by tradition, remains the symbol of the sun, but the light now belongs to many horizons. When night falls over the Nile, the stars shimmer above a land still outwardly whole. Yet beneath the calm surface, the current has changed direction. Power now flows outward, away from Memphis, carried on the same river that once bound the kingdom together. Egypt's perfection has scattered into 100 reflections. Soon, the pharaohs will realize that eternity cannot be governed from a throne alone, and in that realization will begin their long struggle to call the two lands back to one. Messengers raced northward along the Nile, papyrus seals catching the sun as boats skimmed past villages that had long learned to govern themselves. The courtyards at Memphis stirred. New orders were moving again. The palace voice, quiet for years, returned with a steadier cadence and a single name at its center, Pepi I. Inside the audience halls, cedar and fresh ink scented the air. Scribes bent low over waxed boards, copying decrees that would reach Elephantine in the south and the reed-hung inlets of the delta. Governors received envoys with formal bows, touching foreheads to the ground before painted images of the falcon god. For a brief season, the two lands remembered the choreography of obedience. Court strategy began with kinship. Marriage threads bound the throne to provincial houses that had grown rich on temple lands and local dues. A principal queen from Upper Egypt brought with her a network of priests and officials. Cousins and brothers took up posts in the treasuries, the temples, the provincial courts. The design was delicate but clear. Where edict failed, blood might mend. Pepi wagered the future on family. Most mornings opened with councils of viziers, treasurers, and architects. Lists were read, routes plotted. Stone trains would move again along the desert tracks to Wadi Hammamat. Turquoise valleys in Sinai were reopened. Captains in the south negotiated passage to Nubian goldlands. River barges from Byblos brought cedar and resin. Caravans clattered into Memphis with ebony, leopard skins, and incense. The economy rediscovered its pulse, and the storerooms of the great temples began to swell. Workshops revived alongside the roots. Copper hissed in braziers, carpenters shaved curled ribbons from imported wood. Sculptors coaxed a night-slick sheen from diorite for royal statues. In ledgers, scribes tallied rations, bread, beer, onions, issued to quarrymen and ship crews. It was less a triumphal march than a disciplined hum, the sound of a state remembering how to move. Affection, however, is a fragile cement. As royal relatives filled the high offices, loyalty curled inward. An uncle quarrelled with a brother over a chain of quarries. A high priest pledged himself to one royal woman, while another priest swore private oaths to her rival. A general gathered veterans into a following that answered first to him and only then to the crown. Each alliance contained its own seed of faction, and every oath could sour. To still the murmur, the sovereign turned to spectacle. The ancient Sed festival, the 30-year rite of renewal, was planned years in advance, as if the calendar itself might conjure vigor. New courts rose with painted markers for the ritual circuit. Musicians rehearsed, incense stores doubled. When the night came, drums shook the limestone, torches poured yellow light along colonnades, and the ruler traced the course before gods and people. Cheers rolled like surf across the courtyards. Yet even behind the roar, breath shortened. Time could be celebrated, not reversed. Pepi needed the symbol because the symbol was stronger than the man. Beyond the heartland, borders breathed outward. Garrisoned posts secured desert tracks. River stations counted tolls and guarded shipments. Reliefs from this period boast of exotic arrivals, dancers from far oases, dwarfs whose agile steps charmed a court greedy for marvels. Animals shone like living treasure. Prosperity was real. It also taught ambitious men to expect a share. Meanwhile, belief shifted underfoot. The sun's cult at Heliopolis still shone with ritual blaze, but devotion to Osiris deepened, more intimate, more consoling. Resurrection promised by the Lord of the Western lands felt nearer than the cold certainty of the noon sky. In practice, kingship looked less like an embodied god and more like chief steward of a cosmic order that needed tending. As faith changed, so did obedience. Reverence flowed toward tomb and temple estates as readily as toward the throne. On a cliff face, the autobiography of Waning captures the paradox of the hour. He tells of leading armies for the crown, of judging conspiracies whispered inside palace walls. He praises the perfect God, but his lines linger over his own competence. The campaigns he planned, the judgments he rendered, the standards he set. The language of sovereignty had slipped into the mouths of servants. Hierarchy flattened into ambition, even as ritual pretended otherwise. For a time, the illusion held. Floods came on time, fields blackened with silt, granaries filled to their rims, musicians trained for festivals, scribes kept a faithful score, boatmen sang in rhythm with their poles. From village to temple, people spoke of restoration as if it were a harvest that would never fail. Balance, though, is not endurance. The family web that steadied the center also bred rivals. Queens maneuvered for their sons. Courtiers pledged to one heir by morning and another by dusk. In back chambers, oil lamps burned low, while alliances were priced like grain. Requests from distant gnomes multiplied. Provincial lords petitioned for larger tombs. Private endowments to local cults. Seasonal observances once reserved to the royal calendar. Saying yes brought quiet, and quiet looked like unity. The palace, guardian of Ma'at, began to govern by concession. Pepi could still command. More often he calculated. At Saqqara, a new pyramid complex rose for the aging monarch. Modest beside Giza's immensity, rich in emblem and rite. Processions of offering bearers advance forever along its walls. Craftsmen and priests pass eternally with jars and loaves. If one looks closely, the stone admits strain, lighter blocks in the core, joints that needed plaster, places where haste peeks through polish. Architecture mirrored administration, revived, impressive, and stretched thin. Night of Jubilee again. Stars the Egyptians called imperishable, burned high above the courts. Torches spat resin, drums rolled, hymns climbed into the dark. The king approached the altar with measured steps. Priests proclaimed renewal. The crowd believed, or wanted to. Beyond the bright ring, governors counted followers, accountants weighed grain, captains took stock of men and favor. Ceremony could bind for a night. Mourning would belong to arithmetic. Had the reforms outlived their maker, the realm might have regained its old poise. Instead, momentum slipped once the hand that steadied the gears was gone. Nomarchs grew bolder in their provinces. Priestly estates widened like floodwater beyond their banks, and the court found itself everywhere in name and nowhere in force. The restoration became a memory people spoke of with warmth and without precision. In the end, Pepi left two legacies: movement and doubt. He showed that the machine could still turn, that Egypt could rally under a disciplined will. He also proved how much of that will now had to be borrowed from family, from priests, from men whose loyalties could not be bought forever. After his death, edicts shortened, monuments narrowed, prayers lengthened. The crown could still lift stone, but belief no longer rose with it on command. A different answer took form in the silence that followed. If height and weight could no longer guarantee eternity, perhaps words could. Deep within a royal tomb, soon to be sealed, lines would be carved to pilot a soul across the night sky, hymns and spells to persuade what power could not compel. Pepi had tried to bind the living. His successor would try to secure the dead. Thus, the stage readies for Unas, last of his line, his pyramid speaking not through mass, but through text. Where politics faltered, language would attempt the ascent, arguing for divinity, line by line upon the inner stone. The restoration's bright surface lifts, and beneath it another age begins. The age when kings write their way to heaven. Before dawn at Saqqara, the desert breathes cold. The stars pale, the horizon reddens, and for a fleeting instant the world seems weightless, as if waiting for the first word to be spoken. Inside the tomb of Unas, last king of the 5th dynasty, those words already exist. They are carved upon the inner walls, hundreds of them, arranged in perfect lines. Hymns, prayers, and spells. They shimmer faintly under torchlight, the earliest scripture ever written in stone. These are the pyramid texts, Egypt's final conversation with eternity. Their purpose is both simple and profound: to help the king rise among the gods. In earlier ages, architecture alone had promised immortality. The pyramid's height, the solidity of its base, the symmetry that mirrored the cosmos. But by Unas's time, stone was no longer enough. Faith required language. Divinity had to be spoken, not presumed. The outer pyramid of Unas is modest, smaller than those of his forefathers. Its casing has long since fallen, but the core remains, honeycombed with narrow corridors leading to the burial chamber. Within, the ceiling is painted deep blue, studded with golden stars. The walls are dense with hieroglyphs, tiny, meticulous, alive with color. Each sign is a breath, a fragment of spellwork, an attempt to turn ink and chisel into eternity. The texts are not narratives but incantations. They command, cajole, and console. O king, you are the living Horus who flies to the sky on the wings of the falcon. You join the imperishable stars, you eat the gods, you live forever. The words are fierce, almost desperate. They imagine a ruler devouring divinity to sustain his own. Yet behind the grandeur lies unease. If the king must now speak his divinity into being, then divinity has begun to doubt itself. When I walk through that burial chamber, the air feels close and heavy. The walls shimmer with meaning. Every surface speaks. It is as though Unas feared silence more than death. These spells, later copied and adapted for centuries, are the first evidence that immortality, once self-assured, had to be negotiated. The pyramid no longer served as a ladder between earth and heaven. It had become a vessel for language, a library for the soul. Outside the tomb, the landscape tells the same story. The pyramids of the late 5th dynasty have grown smaller, their masonry lighter, their surfaces crowded with inscriptions rather than perfect stonework. The shift is unmistakable. Egypt's confidence has turned inward. Power is no longer displayed through scale, but through text, through mastery of meaning. At Memphis, the court remains busy with ceremony, yet the tone of those ceremonies has changed. The pharaoh still appears as the son of Ra, but his image is less triumphant, more contemplative. Reliefs show him offering incense, praying before the gods rather than commanding them. The ruler's voice is now one among many in a choir of priests. The sun still rises at his command, but only in ritual, not in fact. Across the land, temples multiply, each with its own chorus, each with its own god. The priesthoods of Heliopolis and Abydos compete for authority, and their power seeps into every nome. Egypt's spiritual geography fragments. The divine king, once the living axis of creation, becomes a participant in a system too vast to control. The gods have not abandoned the world. They have simply multiplied beyond the reach of one throne. And yet, for all its fragility, this age is luminous. The artistry of the pyramid texts is astonishing, a theology both cosmic and intimate. They describe the soul's journey through the sky, the reunion with ancestors, the transformation into light. The king rises in the eastern horizon of heaven. One passage reads, "He opens his mouth to speak to the gods, and they answer him." Language itself becomes the stairway to eternity. For the artisans who inscribed these walls, the work was sacred and terrifying. Each symbol had to be flawless. A single omission could unmake the spell. The chisels they used were blessed, the pigments mixed with ritual water. To carve a word was to risk power. Some hieroglyphs, those representing dangerous creatures, were deliberately incomplete, their forms cut to prevent the written world from becoming alive in the wrong way. Even writing demanded restraint. Outside, the Nile continued its ancient rhythm, but the administration that once mirrored its steadiness was faltering. The nomarchs of the provinces kept more of their harvests. The priests claimed larger portions of offerings. The palace distributed what remained to keep the system breathing. The pharaoh's pyramid was built not by national mobilization, but by local obligation. Each region contributed according to favor, not command. Unity survived on habit. As the reign of Unas waned, inscriptions across Egypt began to sound a different note. Nobles spoke of their piety rather than their obedience. They boasted of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and pleasing their local gods. The virtues of the state were now personal acts of morality. Mahat, once enforced from the throne, had become the conscience of individuals. In that change lay both survival and surrender. The idea that only kings could ascend to the stars was fading. In tombs of the wealthy, private versions of the royal texts appear, shortened, adjusted, made intimate. Ordinary men and women, now dared to imagine their own eternity. The monopoly of immortality was ending. The priests of Memphis understood what this meant. They preserved the old rituals, repeating the daily offerings as if repetition itself could prevent erosion. But the murmured prayers at dawn no longer echoed with the certainty of earlier ages. The divine order felt more like memory than law. Each generation added new lines to the texts, not realizing that every addition diluted the power of the old. When the king died, his body was placed within the blue-ceilinged chamber, the stars watching over him. Priests sealed the sarcophagus and recited the spells one final time. Outside, the wind hissed across the sand. No crowds gathered, no great festival marked his passing. The era of monumental funerals had ended quietly, like a song fading at its last refrain. Still, Unas achieved what no conqueror could. Through the words etched on his walls, his voice outlasted the silence of his kingdom. Even as political power thinned, Egypt's spiritual imagination deepened. The gods grew nearer to men. The heavens opened to all who could name them. What the artisans carved into limestone would echo through centuries. A faith transformed from rule to prayer, from decree to whisper. The old certainty of divine kingship was dying, but in its place arose a new conviction. That salvation was no longer the privilege of one body, but the birthright of every soul. And so, beneath the fading glow of the fifth dynasty, Egypt learned to speak its faith aloud. The stones still stood, but their meaning had changed. Eternity had left the summit of the pyramid and taken refuge in the written word. In the first years of his reign, the boy king stood small beneath the columns of Memphis, dwarfed by the statues of his ancestors. Courtiers spoke softly, the regents bowed deeply, and the priests of Ra intoned blessings that filled the hall like a tide. Egypt had seen long reigns before, but none suspected that this one would stretch toward a lifetime. A rule of 90 years that would begin in light and end in shadow. They called him Pepi II, heir to the restorers and child of fragile unity. When he came to the throne, the empire still shone with the polish of the fifth dynasty's order, temples humming with offerings, quarries echoing with chisels, scribes painting records in black and red ink. His mother, the formidable queen, Pepi, governed at first on his behalf. She surrounded the boy with capable men, generals, viziers, and priests, who held the realm together through a combination of habit and loyalty. During those early decades, the land prospered. Expeditions marched again to Nubia for gold and to Punt for incense. Caravans crossed Sinai for copper and turquoise. Reliefs at the pharaoh's pyramid complex record long columns of tribute bearers, the wealth of the south and east flowing toward the throne. The Nile's floods were generous, and the bureaucrats of Memphis still managed their ledgers with the rhythm of the river. But decades have a weight, and 90 of them can crush even a god. As the boy became a man, and the man an old ruler, the machinery that had lifted him began to corrode. His reign was a slow eclipse, brilliant at first, then dimming year by year until even its light became weariness. From the north to the southern frontier, Egypt's governors ruled their nomes as independent lords. They built tombs the size of temples, inscribed with their own boasts. I fed the hungry. I defended my borders. I built for the gods. The inscriptions mention the pharaoh's name as formality, not devotion. Each noble now stood at the center of his own small cosmos. At Memphis, the palace remained the ceremonial heart of the realm, but its pulse weakened. Edicts multiplied without consequence. A reign of orders written to prove the act of ruling, even as authority thinned. royal messengers carried scrolls across the provinces, yet many returned unanswered. The scribes still recorded harvests, but the figures were hopeful guesses. The king's name still opened every letter, though few believed the old man could read them all. As the court aged with him, rivalries hardened into factions. Viziers and chamberlains maneuvered quietly, each aligned with one of the many royal wives and their sons. The palace became a hive of whispering corridors. Behind its polished walls, the dynastic family, once Egypt's spine, turned inward, quarreling over inheritances that would never fully ripen. The priests continued their rituals as if nothing had changed. At dawn, they lifted hymns to Ra. At dusk, they poured libations to Osiris. The pyramids of Saqqara gleamed in the sun, the temples along the river perfumed with myrrh. But beneath the ceremony lay exhaustion. The estates that funded these offerings consumed vast tracts of farmland. More and more of the kingdom's grain went to feed the cults, not the people. The divine economy had become self-devouring. Foreign trade faltered as well. The Red Sea routes grew dangerous. Nubian chiefs guarded their gold with war bands, and the caravans to the east brought fewer goods each season. Expeditions that once returned with luxury now returned with excuses. Egypt's network of supply, the veins of its power, shrank quietly, replaced by barter and favor. The grand pyramids of earlier kings gave way to smaller tombs and modest chapels. Even eternity seemed to demand thrift. In the cities, workers complained of unpaid rations. At the quarries, overseers recorded half-filled deliveries. Across the floodplain, villages that had once labored for the crown now labored for the temples or their local lords. The state no longer directed labor, it rented loyalty. Each nome became its own miniature kingdom, its ruler both priest and landlord. Egypt had turned inward, divided not by war but by weariness. For Pepi himself, the illusion of divine vigor had to be maintained. Each said festival, that ancient rite of renewal, demanded that the king run his ritual circuit before the eyes of the people, proving his fitness to rule both north and south. In youth, he had done so with pride. In old age, attendants half carried him through the motions. The ceremony, once a symbol of vitality, became a pantomime of endurance. The people cheered, but the cheers had the sound of habit. Records from the later reign tell of correspondences written to the distant provinces, letters that mix command with entreaty. Send stone for the pyramid, for the king's tomb waits on your labor. Some provinces complied, others ignored the request. The pyramid that bears his name at Saqqara, though completed, is small and roughly built, its casing gone, its inscriptions brief. The monument of the longest reign in Egyptian history speaks with the softest voice. As his century neared its end, the Nile betrayed its king. Floods grew uncertain, sometimes low, leaving fields cracked and dry, sometimes high, washing away the embankments. Famine shadowed the villages. The state tried to respond, opening granaries, redistributing stores, sending envoys with grain to the starving gnomes. But bureaucracy moved slower than hunger. The officials recorded figures of relief, but their numbers were prayers, not facts. What once was divine stability had become administrative fatigue. The ideology of kingship, that perfect bond between the living pharaoh and the gods, had eroded into ceremony. The ruler remained the center of Egypt's religion, but no longer its energy. Temples multiplied while belief thinned. Ritual continued without conviction. Even the pyramid texts, once the secret of kings, began appearing in the tombs of courtiers and priests. Eternity had grown democratic. At the very end, legend says, Pepi withdrew into silence. The man who had ruled longer than any before him, who had watched his counselors and heirs die one after another, lived to see a kingdom that still bore his name, but no longer his unity. His body, frail and half-divine, became a relic of an age too long extended. To his people, he was not a tyrant or a savior, but something stranger, a god grown old. When he died, the ceremonies were performed as always, priests chanting by torchlight, offerings laid before the sarcophagus, hymns to Ra rising over the desert. But there was no sense of renewal, no promise of endless succession. The funeral of the longest-lived king marked not triumph, but closure. The old machinery had run to stillness. The Egypt that remained was magnificent in form and hollow at its core, an empire of exhaustion. The temples still glowed at sunrise. The pyramids still caught the light, but the people no longer looked to them for certainty. They turned instead to their own shrines, their local gods, their own prayers for the flood to return. The faith that had built the mountains of stone was dissolving back into the river's silt. Pepi II's long reign was no sudden collapse, but a gradual forgetting. 100 years in which eternity itself became too heavy to hold. And as the old king's tomb settled into silence, Egypt itself began to break the habit of obedience. What followed would not be rebellion at first, but absence, a hollowing of purpose that left the land ripe for famine, fear, and fracture. Soon the Nile would falter again, and the gods would seem deaf to the cries of their children. The age of pyramids was ending, and in its twilight, the first shadows of chaos gathered at the horizon. The Nile failed. That was how it began, not with war or invasion, but with silence. The floodwaters that had for millennia risen like breath from the heart of the south came too low to fill the basins. Fields dried into scales of cracked mud. The fish died first, then the cattle. Then the people began to wander. At first, the court in Memphis refused to believe it. The priests read the stars and said that Ra's chariot would soon return the floods. Scribes composed proclamations of reassurance, promising that the next inundation would redeem all want. But the river remained thin, and the basins along its edge filled only with dust. In the villages, altars were built to any god that might listen, to Osiris, to Khnum, to the river itself. The divine order of Egypt had depended on rhythm, and rhythm was gone. Through the brittle air of late harvest, rumors spread faster than royal edicts. The crown sent inspectors upriver, but the reports they returned were contradictory, desperate, full of numbers that had ceased to mean anything. Some nomes claimed rebellion. Others claimed famine. Most claimed both. The messengers often never returned at all. The roads grew unsafe, and caravans that once carried grain between nomes now carried armed guards. In Memphis, the once bustling granaries stood guarded by soldiers. Their doors stayed shut except for temple offerings, which continued even as the people starved. The priests of Ra insisted that the gods must be fed before the living. The king's officials, unwilling to challenge them, obeyed. Bread baked for divine statues filled the air with sweetness, while the alleys outside emptied of voices. The chronicles that survive from these years are fragmentary, half-lines carved in haste, broken tablets, laments scribbled in margins, yet they all speak of the same unraveling. The river is dry, men cross it on foot. The poor own treasure, the rich beg for bread. Mothers weep, and there is none to bury them. Egypt, whose unity had once been its pride, now scattered into 100 desperate islands of survival. The Nomarchs, who had grown powerful under Pepi's long shadow, acted at first as saviors. They opened local granaries, commanded private armies to protect villages, and organized irrigation where they could. Their names appear in tomb inscriptions, not as servants of the pharaoh, but as deliverers of their people. I gave bread to the hungry. I filled the river for my city, one governor wrote at Edfu. Yet even charity hardened into rivalry. Each province now looked to its own, and Egypt itself ceased to be one land. Along the southern bend of the river, a lord named Anktaifi carved his boast into the walls of his rock-cut tomb. I fed my people when the north was starving. I gave water to the thirsty when the river failed. In his words, we hear both pride and terror, the voice of a man who ruled amid the ruin of everything once greater than himself. He speaks of neighboring gnomes devouring their children, of fields without seed, of roads where no traveler passed. Whether the exaggeration is his or the horror itself, no one can tell. In the north, near Heracleopolis, another power rose, gathering the remnants of the central administration. The nobles there claimed the old royal titles and issued decrees in the name of order, but their reach extended little beyond their walls. To the south, Thebes hardened into another center, poorer, hungrier, but fiercely independent. The two lands, united for 1,000 years, were now truly two again. Trade vanished. Ships once heavy with stone and incense lay overturned along the riverbank. Farmers abandoned the delta to wander south in search of better floods. Others turned to the desert oases, where wells still yielded brackish water. Entire villages disappeared, swallowed by sand or memory. The grand causeways that had carried funeral processions to the pyramids now echoed only with wind. The temples endured longer than the state. Their rituals never ceased, even when priests chanted before empty sanctuaries. They recited the hymns that had once awakened the gods each morning. Rise, O Ra, bring the waters, restore the world to balance. But Ra did not answer. The incense smoke drifted upward and vanished in the blue air, unacknowledged. In the carved reliefs of these final kings, there is a subtle change. The pharaoh's figure grows smaller, the gods larger. The divine hierarchy had inverted. Power, once descending from heaven through the king to the people, now rose from the people's pleas, back toward the unreachable sky. Even the great pyramids, still gleaming in the sunlight, began to lose their sanctity. Without the priests and guards to tend them, thieves broke the seals, pried open passageways, and carried off the treasures of the dead. In the silence of abandoned tombs, torches flickered where once hymns had been sung. The monuments built to secure eternity now served as shelters for the living. As famine deepened, the language of the scribes turned elegiac. The land spins like a potter's wheel, one lament reads. The face of every man is pale with hunger, and the tombs are plundered. For the first time, Egyptians wrote not of the eternity they expected, but of the world they feared to lose. The faith that had sustained them fractured into superstition. Magic replaced theology. Clay figures inscribed with curses appeared in households, broken to banish misfortune. The people who had once built the temples of gods now tried to bind them with spells. When belief is betrayed by reality, it seeks smaller miracles. Between Thebes and Heracleopolis lay a stretch of desert, scattered with the tombs of the earliest kings. To plunder them was to break every law of heaven. Yet even those sacred sites were not spared. Desperate soldiers, serving one faction or another, set fire to the royal necropolis at Abydos. The mummies of the first dynasty, the bodies of Egypt's founders, were torn apart and burned. The act would be remembered for centuries as the vile deed. It was not mere desecration, but amnesia made literal, the destruction of memory itself. By the final years of this dark decade, Egypt had no single ruler, no central law, no rhythm, but hunger. The Nile, indifferent to human hope, began at last to rise again, though too late for many. What the waters found was a hollowed kingdom, temples rich but faith thin, villages rebuilt by survivors who remembered little of the age before. Out of this wreckage, two rival thrones would emerge, one in Heracleopolis, one in Thebes. Their kings wore crowns of old design, but ruled lands of new poverty. Between them stretched a frontier of despair. Egypt's first dark age had begun, not the end of civilization, but its forgetting. When the sun rises over Saqqara now, its light still strikes the tips of the pyramids, but the glow feels colder, detached. The monuments stand as they always have, but the civilization that built them has turned away. What was once eternal has become a ruin, even in its own time. The Pyramid Age had promised that stone could preserve order against time. Famine proved otherwise. The river had faltered, and with it, the idea that gods would always sustain their chosen land. Out of that revelation would come something new, a humbler faith, a more human kind of hope. But for now, Egypt lived only by memory and by hunger. From one horizon to the other, Egypt murmured in many tongues, dialects of survival, accents of hunger, prayers whispered to different gods. The land no longer had a single voice. The unity that had once defined the kingdom was now only a memory etched in stone. Between the northern city of Heracleopolis and the southern stronghold of Thebes, the two lands lived apart, staring across the river of history like estranged twins who no longer recognized each other. In the north, the kings of the 9th and 10th dynasties ruled from Heracleopolis, with formality but little substance. They claimed the double crown and called themselves restorers of order, yet their writ rarely reached beyond the delta. Their inscriptions mimic the grandeur of earlier dynasties, though the hands that carved them were clumsy, the lines uneven, the gold leaf thin. Their monuments were modest, their voices brittle. They governed by habit, an imitation of power dressed in the language of the past. In Thebes, far to the south, a different energy stirred. There, a line of local rulers, once mere nomarchs, began to imagine themselves as kings. They took old titles, Lord of the Two Lands, Son of Ra, and spoke them without irony. Though their realm was small, their confidence was vast. Among them was Intef the Great, who fortified the southern nomes, rebuilt local temples, and sent soldiers northward to test the balance of power. From his line would come the family that would one day reunite Egypt. Between these two poles stretched a frontier of ruin. The land of Middle Egypt, once the country's green artery, became a war corridor where famine met fire. Villages switched allegiance depending on which army passed last. At dawn, a town might raise banners to Thebes. By sunset, they had fallen to Heracleopolis. The Nile flowed indifferently through it all, carrying corpses and broken boats downstream. For ordinary people, kingship had become a rumor. Their loyalty belonged not to the distant capitals, but to whoever could fill their granaries or protect their dead. The world of great monuments and divine decrees was gone. In its place rose a society held together by pragmatism. Local priests led prayers. Local strongmen mediated disputes. Scribes recorded births and deaths instead of royal triumphs. The rhythms of daily life resumed, not glorious but persistent. Art followed the same impulse. The polished perfection of Old Kingdom reliefs gave way to rougher hands and regional styles. In provincial tombs, we see farmers with lined faces, women nursing infants, fishermen bent under nets. The gods are there too, but closer now, less majestic, more intimate. It was as if the divine had stepped down from heaven to share the same hunger and fatigue as mortals. Egypt's art, once a mirror of eternity, became a portrait of endurance. Among the few texts that survive from these centuries, one stands apart: the Admonitions of Epua, a lament written by a court poet who lived through the breakdown. "Behold, the river is blood, and men drink of it," he writes. "The poor have become rich, the mighty are destitute. The land turns round as a potter's wheel." His words oscillate between despair and awe, describing a world turned upside down. Yet hidden in his lament is something radical: the first glimmer of social conscience. Suffering had given the Egyptian mind empathy, the ability to see holiness in compassion. The great tombs of this age are humble: brick instead of limestone, mud plastered over with prayers. But they tell a new story. The deceased no longer boasts of divine descent. He boasts of decency. "I was a just man. I fed the hungry. I was kind to the widow." Morality replaces majesty. In the collapse of the old order, Egypt rediscovers humanity. Still, conflict never vanished entirely. Heracleopolitan armies marched south, determined to reclaim their legitimacy. Theban forces replied with equal conviction. For decades, neither side triumphed. Skirmishes flared along the frontier, followed by treaties, marriages, betrayals. The war was not one of annihilation, but attrition, a slow grinding that exhausted both courts, but trained a generation in resilience. During these struggles, Thebes began to change from provincial capital to sacred symbol. Its local god, Amun, once minor, rose to prominence as the hidden one, unseen yet all-pervading. He was the god of survival, of persistence without visibility, a fitting deity for an age that lived unseen by history. The Thebans claimed his favor, believing that while Heracleopolis held the visible crown, Thebes held the invisible mandate. In art and ritual, the shift is clear. The sun-drenched optimism of the Old Kingdom yields to shadowed devotion. Temples are smaller, but filled with song. Sculpture is rougher, but alive with feeling. The people no longer build for eternity, but for memory. Eternity had proven too costly. Memory, they discovered, was enough. Even in ruin, Egypt did not forget how to hope. The floods eventually returned with greater steadiness, replenishing the exhausted soil. Farmers rebuilt canals, planted barley and flax. Trade revived in modest forms, caravans carrying salt, linen, and dried fish between the fragmented cities. Slowly, painfully, life began to resemble something stable again. The great revelation of this dark century was not that empires fall, but that civilization can survive them. Without a central crown, Egypt remained Egypt, 1,000 small loyalties stitched together by shared language, by ritual, by memory of what had been. The people no longer believed their kings were gods, yet they still believed in Ma'at, the balance that governed the world. In that belief lay the seed of renewal. When the Theban line finally consolidated power under Mentuhotep I, they claimed not victory, but restoration. Their scribes called it the return of unity, as if the river itself had mended. It would take another generation for that unity to become real, but the direction was clear. Thebes, once the province of famine and faith, had become the forge of rebirth. The first intermediate period ended not with a conquest, but with an idea that power could be human, not divine, that kingship could be service rather than spectacle. Egypt emerged chastened, smaller in pride, but greater in self-awareness. When the sun rose over Thebes in those final years, it shone not on pyramids, but on fields being ploughed anew, on temples rebuilt by tired hands, on a people who had learned that eternity is not the absence of change, but the courage to endure it. Dawn returns to the valley of Thebes. The sun climbs over cliffs streaked with red and gold, and the river below glitters like a sword drawn anew. For generations, this land had known famine and war, but now its fields shimmer green again. The canals run full. The air smells of grain and wet earth. Egypt, long divided between north and south, feels its pulse steady. From this valley of gods and ghosts rises a man who will end the long night. Mentuhotep II, ruler of Upper Egypt, heir to a line of stubborn provincial lords who dared to call themselves kings. He inherits neither empire nor peace, only the determination to reclaim both. Around him gather soldiers hardened by decades of border fighting, priests who have seen temples crumble, and scribes who remember unity only from ancient hymns. His campaign to reunite the two lands begins quietly. Envoys sail north along the Nile, carrying letters of alliance wrapped in silken cords. When diplomacy fails, armies follow. The men of Thebes march through ruined towns, where walls bear the scars of old battles. They restore order not by conquest alone, but by rebuilding what war destroyed: bridges, granaries, shrines. Villagers welcome them with cautious gratitude. After years of chaos, any discipline feels like mercy. At Heracleopolis, the rival court holds fast. Its kings, weary and surrounded, still claim the double crown. Their scribes copy decrees of stability while their armies dwindle. Between the two powers, the war stretches on, not a single storm, but a long erosion. Each campaign carries Theban banners farther north, until finally the walls of Heracleopolis fall, their gates opened by famine and surrender rather than flame. Egypt, at last, is won again. The victory is not celebrated with the arrogance of earlier dynasties. The Theban ruler, standing before his soldiers, does not declare himself God reborn, but the servant of Ma'at, the restorer of balance. His coronation hymn, preserved in fragments, speaks not of eternity, but of gratitude. I have united the two lands. I have driven hunger from their hearts. I have made every face to smile. The tone is humble, almost human. The gods, it seems, have grown closer to earth. In the wake of unification, Mentuhotep turns from war to rebuilding. Across the floodplain, canals are dredged and temples repaired. Farmers are granted seed grain from royal stores. Scribes standardize records and laws, reweaving the fabric of administration that had unraveled during the long dark. The kingdom's energy shifts from survival to creation. Egypt enters what later generations will call the Middle Kingdom, an era not of divine arrogance, but of moral clarity. To honor his triumphant faith, Mentuhotep commissions a tomb unlike any before. On the western cliffs of Thebes, at Deir el-Bahari, a great terrace complex rises where rock meets desert. Its colonnades stand open to the sky, as if inviting the wind to bear prayers upward. The design is neither pyramid nor temple, but a fusion of both. Monumental, yet contemplative. Here the king will rest, not as a god apart, but as a man among gods, protected by the goddess Hathor, whose spirit is said to dwell within these cliffs. When I stand among its pillars, I feel the intention behind every line. The columns echo the rhythm of the Nile. The terraces climb like steps of light. The reliefs along the walls show processions of soldiers, priests, and craftsmen, not slaves, but builders of a restored world. The imagery is solemn, even tender. After centuries of ruin, Egypt's art speaks again with conviction, but without the old perfection's cruelty. Mentuhotep's architects call upon the traditions of the past, while reshaping them for a new vision. The bright geometry of the pyramid gives way to the depth of corridors, the interplay of shadow and light. Where once stone declared eternity, now it evokes transition. The passage from chaos to peace, from death to renewal. The tomb is both memorial and metaphor. The king's reign also reshapes religion. The god Amun, patron of Thebes, ascends to prominence, merging with Ra to become Amun-Ra, the unseen sun, hidden yet universal. His cult emphasizes mystery and introspection, mirroring the people's new understanding of divinity. Faith is no longer performed in stone, but experienced in conscience. Egypt, bruised by history, learns to pray with humility. Among the people, prosperity returns cautiously. Harvests fill granaries. Trade routes reopen along the Red Sea and the eastern deserts. Merchants carry papyrus, linen, and gold to foreign shores. In return come cedar, lapis, and spice. The state grows efficient but measured, its officials aware that excess once destroyed their forefathers. In the fields, farmers mark the floods with quiet relief instead of festival, reverence born of remembrance. The scribes of this age record not boasts, but lessons. In their manuals of conduct, copied for young officials, they write, "Do not be proud of knowledge. The wise may be silent in heart. Rule by justice, not by fear." It is as if the bureaucracy itself has acquired a conscience. The wisdom literature of the Middle Kingdom begins here, Egypt turning reflection into policy. Still, Mentuhotep's unification was not achieved without blood. Archaeologists who unearthed a tomb near his temple found the bodies of his soldiers, 60 men laid side by side, wounds unhealed, their linen wrappings coarse but reverent. They are Egypt's first recorded war dead, buried not as anonymous troops, but as honored companions. The king remembered their sacrifice as part of his own immortality, binding duty to resurrection. By the end of his reign, the land has changed in spirit as much as in structure. The gods no longer speak through thunder or flood. They whisper through conscience. Kingship is no longer the mirror of heaven, but its steward. The people, having lived through the silence of the Nile, trust less in miracle and more in balance. When Mentuhotep dies, his body is laid to rest in the tomb he built among the cliffs. The funerary rites are simple by royal standards, offerings of bread, beer, and flowers, hymns sung by priests of Hathor. The inscription on his sarcophagus is short, almost austere, "He who brought peace to the two lands." There is no boast of conquest, no claim to divinity, only the record of restoration. Behind the western hills, the sun descends, its rays running deep into the halls of Deir el-Bahari. The cliffs glow crimson, and for a moment the desert itself seems alive with breath. In that light, Egypt's long ordeal finds closure. The river, faithful once more, winds through a land that has learned to begin again. The age of pyramids is over, but something deeper has taken its place. A vision of eternity not carved in stone, but lived in balance. Egypt, chastened and renewed, steps into its second youth, aware at last that permanence belongs not to monuments, but to the will to rebuild them. Across the centuries, Egypt remembers itself in stone. The pyramids rise from the desert like frozen thoughts, their sharp edges blurred by time, their purpose still intact even when their meaning has changed. Travelers stand before them and ask the same question that haunted the generations who came after. Why did this age of perfection end? The answer lies not in a single cause, but in the slow weaving of many: nature, ambition, faith, and the weariness of time. The first kings had believed that order was eternal, if only it could be built large enough. They did not foresee that eternity, like the river, demands renewal. The Nile, so faithful for centuries, betrayed them first. In the later Old Kingdom, a cycle of weak floods starved the land. Without the river's rhythm, Egypt's economy, founded on grain and irrigation, faltered. Famine stripped away the illusion that divine order was immune to chance. When hunger comes, even gods are questioned. The people who had seen the pyramids as proof of divine favor began to see them as monuments to the silence of heaven. At the same time, the brilliance of Egypt's own success had turned inward. The great pyramid projects that unified labor and faith under a single vision grew too vast to sustain. To quarry, transport, and raise millions of stones demanded the full strength of a nation. For generations, that effort had been its heartbeat. Eventually, the heart began to tire. The bureaucracy that managed it, perfected by kings like Sneferu and Khufu, became a power unto itself, capable of recording everything, incapable of renewal. When the system outlived the spirit that made it, it remained only as machinery, turning without purpose. The priests, too, had changed. In the early days, they were servants of the king's divinity. By the 5th dynasty, they had become its rivals. Each temple owned fields, herds, workshops, and slaves. Their wealth grew exempt from royal tax, their estates multiplying as the crowns shrank. What began as piety became power, and power demanded autonomy. By Pepi's age, the gods had learned to feed themselves without the king's permission. Then came the long reign of Pepi II, a century of endurance that became a century of decline. Under his ancient rule, the kingdom simply aged. The pyramid state, that great engine of divine order, had run too long on faith and habit. When famine struck, no one believed the court could command the river back to life. When the king finally died, the people were left not with rebellion, but with emptiness. The structure remained, but the meaning had gone out of it. And yet, the fall of the Old Kingdom was not the fall of Egypt. The people endured, rebuilding from the mud what the stone had lost. The first intermediate period revealed what the Pyramid Age had hidden, that Egypt's strength was not its kings, but its continuity. Nomarchs, priests, and farmers all carried fragments of the old order forward, preserving language, ritual, and art through an age of hunger. When unity returned under Thebes, it was rebirth, not resurrection. There were deeper lessons, too. The Pyramid Age had believed in eternity made visible, that the divine could be captured in geometry, in stone that defied decay. But the centuries taught that permanence belongs only to rhythm, not to mass. The river's annual rise and fall, the sowing and harvest, the day's return from darkness. These were Egypt's true monuments. The pyramids were only their reflection, and when that reflection became too heavy to carry, the people turned back to the living world. Religious faith followed this same arc. The gods did not vanish, they changed. The sun cult of Ra, once imperial, gave way to the gentler promise of Osiris, resurrection through compassion rather than dominion. Divinity became less a matter of rule than of mercy. The idea that all souls could share the afterlife, not just kings, was the quiet revolution born of collapse. Out of loss came equality. Climate, politics, and belief all played their parts, but at the core of the Old Kingdom's end was exhaustion, not of materials, but of certainty. The belief that the world could be made perfect had sustained Egypt for half a millennium. Its failure was not catastrophe, but transformation. When faith in divine kingship cracked, it revealed the human beneath, a civilization capable of adaptation. To walk among the pyramids now is to feel that transformation still breathing through the stone. Their sides, once blinding white, are scarred by centuries of wind, yet the precision of their lines remains. They are both ruin and record, proof of what humans can do when they believe the world has meaning, and proof of what they learn when that belief falters. Standing before them at sunset, one can trace the whole arc of the age. The step pyramid of Djoser, experimental and bold, speaks of beginnings. Sneferu's red pyramid, of perfection reached through failure. Khufu's great pyramid, of triumph. The smaller tombs of later kings, of restraint. And the inscriptions of Unaz, of the inward turn. Together, they form a chronicle in stone, a rise, a flowering, and a return to earth. The collapse of the Pyramid Age was not a disaster to mourn, but a truth to understand. No order, however divine, survives without renewal. The Old Kingdom died because it succeeded too well. It froze perfection into form and left no room for growth. The Middle Kingdom that followed would learn to balance stone with spirit, monument with mercy. Egypt never abandoned its past. The kings of later ages still gazed upon the pyramids with reverence, seeing in them both a warning and a dream. They built on smaller scales, hid their tombs in cliffs and valleys, but they kept the old idea alive, that to rule was to preserve balance, not to defy time. The wind rises over Giza now, whispering through the limestone blocks, scattering sand across the causeways where once thousands marched. The pyramids no longer command labor or worship, yet they still command silence. They are the memory of Egypt's first faith, that human hands, guided by order, could touch eternity, that faith ended, and from its ending came wisdom. The Nile still flows. The peoples still live. The gods still change their names. The pyramids stand, not as proof of perfection, but as monuments to endurance. Their stone remembers what the living learned long ago, that all things rise, shine, and fade, and that in the fading there is also rebirth.